The county surveyor arrived just after noon, his truck crunching over the same gravel they had already tried to erase that morning. I stood near the broken edge of my access road, watching him unfold a long metal measuring tape across ground that was still shifting from the excavation. The HOA crew had paused, but their machines were still idling, vibrating through the air like they were waiting for permission to continue. Linda Marshall stayed close to the bulldozer, arms still crossed, her expression unchanged. The surveyor did not speak at first. He marked points, checked coordinates, then looked up toward the HOA map pinned to the hood of their truck. That was when the silence changed. He asked them who authorized cutting beyond the recorded boundary. No one answered immediately. The operator glanced at Linda. Linda glanced at the deputy. Deputy Ryan Cole adjusted his stance but said nothing. The surveyor walked the line again, slower this time, tapping stakes already placed inside my property. I could see it in his posture now, something was off. He pulled out a second document from his folder, older paper, folded at the edges, and compared it directly against the HOA blueprint. The wind picked up slightly, dragging dust across the exposed trench. I noticed the irrigation markers near the lower slope beginning to shift from runoff exposure, the same system that controlled water distribution for the entire valley basin below my land. If that line failed, it would not just be my property affected. It would cascade downstream into managed flow zones I had legal oversight on. That realization changed the air around me. Linda finally stepped forward, insisting this was within easement expansion rights, but her voice carried less certainty than before. The surveyor shook his head once, then pointed at a coordinate that clearly extended past any recorded access agreement. That single motion made the entire crew go still. Even the machine engines seemed to idle lower. I looked past them toward my gate control terminal mounted on the far fence line, still active, still connected to the irrigation system beneath the property. They had not seen it yet, but the system they were cutting through was not isolated land. It was part of a controlled network tied to permits they had never reviewed. Deputy Ryan Cole finally spoke, asking for clarification, but the surveyor raised a hand, telling him to wait. He was now tracing the full perimeter again, faster, like he had just realized the scale of what had been disturbed. I saw Linda glance toward the trench for the first time without confidence. The soil near the irrigation junction began to shift more visibly, small channels forming where the structure beneath had been exposed. That was when I realized they were not just working inside a disputed line anymore, they were standing inside a system that was about to respond on its own. The surveyor's voice cut through the dust like a warning no one expected. He pointed at the second set of markers and said the recorded boundary did not match the ground they were standing on. I watched Linda Marshall's posture tighten for the first time. She stepped closer to the map, tapping a corner that extended directly into my irrigation corridor. The county document in the surveyor's hand showed something different entirely, a restriction line that predated the HOA by decades. The wind moved across the exposed trench, carrying loose soil toward the lower slope where the irrigation junction sat buried beneath thin cover. I could hear the faint vibration of water pressure adjusting inside the underground system, the kind of shift that only happens when upstream flow is disrupted. Deputy Ryan Cole finally asked for clarification again, but the surveyor did not answer immediately. He was now tracing the full extension of the access cut, moving faster, checking alignment against a second archival map pulled from his truck. That was when I noticed the change in the machines. The operator had stopped digging and was now watching the surveyor instead of Linda. Something in the air had shifted from construction to verification. Linda tried to regain control, insisting this was approved expansion, but her tone carried less certainty than before. The surveyor shook his head and marked another point, this time outside the supposed easement entirely. I felt the ground beneath my boots settle unevenly as runoff began redirecting toward the lower basin channel. That system was not just irrigation. It was tied to managed distribution rights I controlled across the valley network, and any breach would trigger automatic pressure redistribution downstream. I turned slightly toward the gate control terminal at the far edge of the property, still active, still reading live flow data. The display showed minor fluctuations already forming. Not enough to alarm most people, but enough to confirm that the system was reacting to physical disruption. Linda followed my gaze for the first time. She did not speak. The deputy stepped closer to the surveyor, asking if there was a legal conflict, but the surveyor only replied that the construction was crossing into protected zoning coordinates. The phrase landed differently now. The machinery behind them idled lower, as if even the operator understood the uncertainty. I walked a few steps closer to the trench, watching soil continue to collapse into the exposed channel. The irrigation markers beneath the surface were no longer stable. Small adjustments in pressure were echoing through the system like a chain reaction waiting for confirmation. Linda finally looked toward me directly, but her confidence was gone. The surveyor lowered his map slightly, revealing a second stamped seal on the document I had never seen before. It was then that I realized the excavation was not just unauthorized. It had already triggered a regulatory review at a level none of them had anticipated, and the system I controlled was preparing to respond in full. The moment the surveyor lowered his map, the entire construction site seemed to lose its rhythm. The machines were still running, but no one was moving with confidence anymore. Dust drifted through the air in slow waves, settling over the exposed trench like a warning that had already been delivered too late. I stood near the edge of the irrigation corridor, watching the system readings on the control terminal flicker again. The numbers were no longer stable. Small pressure shifts were propagating through the underground network, adjusting flow. Distribution across multiple zones downstream. Linda Marshall stepped back toward the bulldozer, but her movement was slower now, less certain. The deputy followed the surveyor as he pointed out a second coordinate mismatch on the archival map, and I could hear fragments of their conversation breaking through the noise of idling engines. The word protected was repeated twice. Then came the silence. The operator finally shut down one of the machines, and the sudden drop in vibration made the ground feel heavier beneath my feet. I glanced toward the lower slope where the irrigation junction sat buried. The soil above it was no longer stable. Water flow indicators on my terminal began adjusting automatically, responding to pressure loss in real time. That system was designed to compensate for external disruption, but only within legal boundaries I controlled. Anything beyond that triggered escalation protocols at county-level oversight. Linda turned back toward me, her expression tight now, as if she was trying to understand something that was no longer within her authority. The surveyor walked closer to her and pointed again at the official boundary line stamped decades earlier. His voice was steady, but the implication was clear. The excavation had crossed into restricted infrastructure zoning. That meant the access cut was no longer just a property dispute. It was now a regulatory violation involving managed land systems. Deputy Ryan Cole finally asked if operations should pause, but no immediate answer came from the HOA side. The machines behind them idled in place, engines humming at low frequency like they were waiting for instruction that no one wanted to give. I took a step forward and looked directly at the control terminal again. The irrigation system showed a new shift in flow direction, subtle but spreading. That was the moment I realized the breach had reached the secondary channel, the one feeding the lower basin farms. Those were not part of HOA jurisdiction. They were tied to a regional water management agreement I had legal standing over. Linda followed my gaze again, this time longer. The confidence she had at the start of the morning was gone. Completely. The surveyor closed his folder and said something about immediate documentation required for county review. The word review changed the atmosphere again. The operator finally stepped away from the controls, leaving the machine silent. I could hear wind moving across the exposed trench now, carrying soil into the opening where the ground had been cut too deep. The irrigation system beneath responded once more, stabilizing briefly, then adjusting again as if recalibrating its entire baseline. That was when I saw it on the terminal screen. A notification had appeared, confirming external interference detection across the controlled flow network, and it was escalating toward full system audit status. The notification on my terminal stayed frozen for a second before updating again, and when it did, the entire system layout shifted into a higher alert state. External interference detection had moved from passive monitoring into active county review protocol. That meant the irrigation network was no longer just responding locally, it was now being evaluated at jurisdiction level with full data logging across all connected zones. I stood still at the edge of the trench, watching the numbers stabilize for a moment before fluctuating again, this time with clearer directional rerouting toward downstream reservoirs. The wind carried dust across the exposed soil, and the machines behind me were still silent, engines idling but no longer advancing. Linda Marshall stepped closer to the surveyor, her voice lower now, asking what exactly was being flagged in the system. The surveyor did not answer immediately. He was focused on his tablet, cross-referencing the original county zoning archive against live interference data. Deputy Ryan Cole shifted his stance and looked toward me for the first time without certainty, as if waiting for clarification that was no longer his responsibility. The irrigation terminal updated again, showing controlled flow deviation beyond the permitted threshold I had been maintaining for years. That was the second escalation. The system was now compensating not just for physical disruption, but for unauthorized boundary engagement. I exhaled slowly and walked closer to the control panel mounted near the gate structure. It was still active, still fully authenticated under my credentials. Behind me, I heard Linda insist this was a standard community expansion project, but her tone no longer matched the data the surveyor was reading out loud. He finally spoke, confirming that the excavation had crossed into protected hydrological infrastructure tied to county-managed distribution. That changed everything in the field. The machines were officially flagged as operating within restricted overlay zones, and the operator finally disengaged one of them completely, lowering the bucket and stepping away as if distance alone could reduce liability. I tapped the control panel once, bringing up the full irrigation map. The lower basin channels were now showing pressure redistribution across 3 separate downstream nodes. That meant the system was preparing for automatic regulatory reporting. Linda turned back toward me, and for the first time there was no authority in her expression, only calculation. Deputy Ryan Cole asked if I had control over the water system readings, but the surveyor interrupted before I could respond, stating that control was not the issue anymore, compliance was. The word hung in the air as the wind shifted again, pushing loose soil deeper into the trench. I could see the line of disturbance extending further than the original cut, creeping toward the secondary irrigation junction that fed the agricultural zone below. That was the point of no simple correction. The system did not allow partial overrides once external interference reached protected flow nodes. The terminal screen updated again, this time displaying a county-level audit initiation timestamp. Linda stepped back slightly, looking at the surveyor as if expecting him to reverse it, but he only closed his folder and confirmed that the report had already been transmitted. The machines were now fully stopped. No engine noise remained except distant wind across the exposed land. I stood beside the control panel and watched the irrigation map stabilize into locked audit mode, where every adjustment would now be logged and verified externally. That was when I realized the excavation was no longer the main issue. The system itself had already moved beyond their control, and whatever came next would not be decided on this ground anymore. The county audit status locked in place on my screen for nearly a minute before expanding into a full system trace. I watched as the irrigation network map unfolded layer by layer, showing every connected zone downstream of my property. What had started as a localized excavation issue was now fully mapped into a regional water distribution framework. The system was no longer treating this as a land dispute. It was treating it as infrastructure interference across a protected hydrological grid. I stood by the control terminal, reading each update as it populated in real time. Linda Marshall remained near the trench, but she was no longer issuing instructions. The surveyor had shifted fully into documentation mode, photographing coordinates and marking timestamps. Deputy Ryan Cole had moved slightly away from the machines, now standing between the HOA crew and the exposed irrigation corridor as if distance could reduce responsibility. The machines were still idle, but their presence now felt heavier than when they were running. The silence was different. It was administrative silence, the kind that happens right before a formal decision is recorded. I scrolled through the irrigation interface again and saw the second layer of alerts activate. County environmental compliance had entered the system. That meant external engineers were now reviewing the data feed directly. Linda finally stepped closer to me, her voice lower, asking what exactly was going to happen next. I did not answer immediately because the screen updated before I could speak. A formal notice line had appeared, stating that all flow modifications in the affected basin were now under temporary federal review pending structural validation. The wording changed everything in the field. The HOA crew began looking at each other instead of the land. The surveyor stepped back from the trench and confirmed that his report had already synchronized with county servers. That meant the documentation was no longer local. It was already part of a higher-level regulatory file. I looked toward the irrigation junction again. The soil above it was no longer just disturbed. It was now marked as active review zone on the system overlay. That designation meant no further physical work could continue without violating compliance restrictions. Linda turned toward the machines and signaled for them to shut down completely. One by one, the engines were powered off until only wind remained across the site. I moved closer to the control terminal and opened the full historical layer of the system. It showed every recorded adjustment in water flow over the past several years, all tied to authorized permits under my management. Now, for the first time, there were red-flagged entries marking the exact coordinates where the excavation had crossed into protected infrastructure. Deputy Ryan Cole finally approached the surveyor and asked what authority had triggered the federal review, but the surveyor only pointed to the automated compliance signature embedded in the irrigation system itself. That was when I understood the shift was no longer controlled by anyone standing on this land. The system had escalated itself based on violation thresholds already built into the infrastructure network. Linda looked at me again, but this time she did not speak. The wind moved through the exposed trench, carrying loose soil toward the lower basin channel, and I watched the system continue updating as if preparing for a decision that had already been made elsewhere. The system notification expanded again, this time showing a full audit chain linking the irrigation network to a county-level compliance server. I watched the interface refresh in real time, each update pulling more data from external regulatory databases that had just gone active. The field below me was no longer just a construction site. It was now fully logged as a monitored infrastructure incident. Linda Marshall stood still near the edge of the trench, her arms no longer crossed. The posture was different now. Less control. More observation. The surveyor had moved completely into documentation mode, taking sequential photos of every marker that had been disturbed. Deputy Ryan Cole remained between the crew and the exposed irrigation line, but even he was no longer giving instructions. Everyone was waiting for something above their authority level to respond. The terminal at my side updated again. A new authorization layer had appeared, marked County Engineering Compliance Escalation. That meant the system had triggered a formal review path that bypassed local control entirely. I exhaled slowly and scrolled through the irrigation topology map. Every downstream node was now visible, stretching far beyond my property into agricultural zones that depended on regulated flow consistency. Any disruption here was not isolated. It was systemic. The machines behind me remained powered down, but the ground they had cut into was still unstable. Water pressure readings began to normalize unevenly, adjusting across multiple control points. That was the first sign that the system was actively rerouting itself to compensate for unauthorized excavation. Linda finally stepped closer to the surveyor and asked what the next step would be, but the surveyor only pointed at his tablet and showed her the live synchronization feed. County Environmental Oversight had already received the full report package, including timestamps, coordinates, and flow disruption metrics. That meant this was no longer a field dispute. It was now a formal infrastructure violation under active review. Deputy Ryan Cole looked at me briefly, then back at the surveyor, as if trying to understand where jurisdiction had shifted. I did not need to answer. The system already had. A second notification appeared on the terminal, confirming that temporary federal engineering review had been initiated due to cross-boundary water system interference. That phrase changed the entire atmosphere on site. Linda's expression tightened again, but she said nothing. The surveyor closed his folder slowly, confirming that no further construction activity was permitted until the review concluded. The operator stepped away from the machine completely, leaving the arm suspended over the trench like it had been frozen mid-action. Wind moved through the exposed cut in the land, carrying loose soil toward the lower basin intake point. I watched the irrigation interface adjust again, this time stabilizing pressure across 3 separate downstream control nodes. That stabilization was not manual. It was automated system response under regulatory lock. Linda turned slightly toward me, but there was no challenge left in her expression. Only recognition that the situation had moved beyond her authority. The deputy finally spoke again, asking for clarification from county engineering, but the surveyor only confirmed that all active modifications were now subject to external compliance authority. I glanced once more at the gate terminal. It was still active, still connected, still holding full control credentials over the irrigation network. But now every action on it was being mirrored in real time by an external audit system. That was when I realized the field was no longer controlled by any single person standing on it. The system itself had become the decision maker, and everything happening on my land was now being evaluated somewhere far beyond this valley. The first sign that the field had fully collapsed into federal review was the sudden arrival of marked county engineering vehicles on the access road. I watched them roll in slowly, not like construction support, but like a formal inspection unit entering a controlled site. Dust from the earlier excavation still hung in the air, drifting over the exposed trench where the irrigation junction had been disturbed. Linda Marshall stood near the bulldozer that had been shut down for nearly 20 minutes now. Her posture had changed completely. The confidence that had carried her earlier was gone, replaced by a stillness that suggested she was waiting for instructions from somewhere she could no longer influence. The surveyor stepped forward to meet the arriving county engineers, handing over his full documentation packet without hesitation. I remained at the control terminal, watching as the system interface updated again with a new status banner confirming full regulatory takeover. That meant every active component of the irrigation network was now under supervised control review. Deputy Ryan Cole had moved away from the center of the site and was speaking quietly into his radio, but even his tone had shifted. There was no attempt to assert authority anymore. Only reporting. The county engineers walked directly to the exposed irrigation corridor, scanning the ground markers and cross-referencing them with handheld devices. One of them stopped at the exact point where the trench intersected the protected flow line. He looked down, then back at the map, then confirmed something without speaking aloud. I could see it in the way he marked the location with a red tag. That single mark changed the entire tone of the site. Linda finally stepped forward again, asking if work could resume once clarification was complete, but the engineer did not look at her. He simply stated that all activity within the marked zone was now suspended until final compliance resolution. The words were calm, but absolute. The machines remained off, their presence now reduced to static equipment rather than active construction. I checked the irrigation terminal again. The system had shifted into full protective stabilization mode. That meant all downstream flow points were now locked under regulated pressure thresholds. Any further disturbance would trigger automatic escalation reporting beyond county level. Linda turned slightly toward me again, but this time she did not attempt to assert control. The surveyor closed his folder and confirmed that all field documentation had been successfully transmitted to the state infrastructure oversight system. That was the final administrative threshold. Deputy Ryan Cole stepped back completely, no longer between any parties, simply observing the field as jurisdiction moved away from the local level entirely. The county engineers began placing temporary markers around the trench, establishing a controlled perimeter. I stayed at the terminal, watching the irrigation map stabilize into a locked configuration. Every downstream node had now been synchronized under compliance oversight, ensuring no unverified adjustments could occur. The wind moved through the exposed cut in the land, carrying dust across the new perimeter lines. Linda stood motionless near the edge of the site, looking at the marked ground as if recalculating what had just happened. The system interface displayed one final update confirming that full regulatory audit control was active and irreversible until review completion. That was when I realized the situation had completely transitioned away from physical construction and into formal infrastructure adjudication, and everything now depended on decisions being made far beyond the valley itself. The final update on the system terminal arrived without sound, only a visual shift that locked the entire irrigation network into a completed audit state. I stood beside the control panel as the interface transitioned from active monitoring to full regulatory closure mode. Every downstream node on the map was now marked as verified under state infrastructure oversight. The county engineers had already finished their perimeter placement around the trench, and the exposed irrigation junction was no longer treated as a construction site but as a secured compliance zone. Linda Marshall remained near the edge of the marked boundary, no longer speaking, no longer directing anyone. The authority she had tried to assert earlier had fully dissolved into documentation she could not influence. The surveyor stood with the county team, confirming final transmission of all field data into the state system. Deputy Ryan Cole had stepped completely away from the operation area, now positioned at the side of the access road, speaking quietly into his radio with a tone that carried no urgency, only confirmation of procedural closure. I looked at the irrigation terminal one more time. The system was stable, but now permanently locked under external oversight. That meant every flow adjustment, every pressure regulation point, and every downstream distribution node was now subject to state validation. There would be no local override, no manual intervention, no HOA influence that could alter the current state. The wind moved across the valley floor, carrying dust through the newly established perimeter markers. The construction machines remained silent, their roles reduced to inactive equipment awaiting removal authorization. Linda finally walked a few steps closer to the surveyor, asking for clarification about future access rights, but the answer she received was not directed at her. It was recorded into the system as a formal restriction notice. The surveyor explained that all prior assumptions of HOA authority over the affected corridor were now invalid under verified infrastructure jurisdiction. I stayed at the terminal, watching the final confirmation sequence complete. A full audit stamp appeared on the screen, marking the irrigation network as compliant under state-level enforcement protocol. That single update finalized everything that had happened since the first excavation cut into my land. The deputy closed his communication channel and stepped fully out of the field area, signaling that law enforcement presence was no longer required. The county engineers began dismantling temporary markers, replacing them with official boundary identifiers that aligned with the validated survey record. Linda stood motionless now, watching the replacement markers being installed over the same ground her team had attempted to reassign earlier. I did not move from the control panel. The system interface showed one final status line confirming that all irrigation flow systems had been restored to regulated stability under protected zoning conditions. The valley beyond the trench returned to silence, no machinery, no active construction, only wind moving through the exposed earth. I looked across the entire site one last time, seeing every change now recorded, verified, and locked into official state infrastructure records. The situation had fully transitioned from local dispute to permanent regulatory outcome, and there was nothing left on the ground that anyone could change anymore.